On a cold night, with nowhere left to go, Emily Carter stood in the rain holding a card that should have been forgotten decades ago. The kind of object most people would have thrown away without a second thought. But this one felt different the moment her fingers touched it, worn at the edges, faded in a way that suggested time had tried and failed to erase it. And as she slid it into the machine, she wasn't thinking about wealth or consequences or hidden secrets. She was thinking about survival, about what happens when life strips everything away and leaves you with nothing but a memory and a final option. And in that quiet moment, as the machine hesitated, something far bigger than Emily Carter began to move, something that had been dormant for years, waiting, almost as if this exact moment had always been inevitable. And somewhere far from that dimly lit ATM, systems woke up, screens flickered, and people who had never heard her name suddenly had a reason to care. Because what Emily didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that this card was never just a card. It was a key. And the moment she used it, she unlocked a story that had been buried long before she was ever born. A story tied to a man few people remembered, but many had quietly benefited from. A man whose decisions decades earlier would now collide with her present in a way no one could have predicted. And as the machine finally responded, not with approval or denial, but with silence that felt heavier than either, the first signal was sent, deep into a network that rarely reacted to anything anymore. And yet this time, it did, immediately, urgently, as though something important had just resurfaced without warning, and in offices miles away, employees paused, confused by what they were seeing, because according to reports, the account tied to that card wasn't supposed to be active. It wasn't even supposed to appear in the system at all, and yet there it was, fully intact, untouched by time, carrying a history that no modern database could fully explain. And within seconds, what started as a routine transaction became something else entirely. Something that triggered alerts not used in years, drawing attention upward through layers of authority until it reached a place few incidents ever reach. The office of a man who rarely involved himself in individual cases, and yet on this night, he did, because what appeared on his screen didn't just represent an account. It represented a question, one that had never been fully answered, one that had quietly remained unresolved for decades. And as Emily stood there, unaware of the chain reaction she had just set in motion, holding on to the hope that maybe, just maybe, this card would give her a way forward, the system continued to process, pulling fragments of a past that had been carefully stored, almost hidden in plain sight. And the more it revealed, the clearer it became that this wasn't just about money. It was about something much deeper, something tied to decisions made long ago, decisions that were never meant to surface again. And yet here they were, rising back into view because one woman had no other choice. And before we go any further, before we uncover what investigators later began to piece together about this account and the man behind it, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what follows is not just the story of Emily Carter. It is the story of how a single moment can reopen a chapter that was never truly closed. How something as simple as an old card can carry consequences far beyond what anyone expects. And how, according to reports, the deeper investigators looked into this case, the more complicated it became, raising questions not only about who Emily's grandfather really was, but about why this account had remained untouched for so long, protected in a way that suggested intention rather than oversight. And as the CEO picked up the phone that night, making a call he would later describe as necessary, not optional, Emily Carter's life, which had already been turned upside down by loss and betrayal, was about to change again, this time in a way that would force her to confront a past she barely understood, and a legacy she never asked to inherit. And at the center of it all was a man named Robert Carter, her grandfather, a name that, according to archived records and financial reports from decades earlier, had once carried weight in circles most people never see. A man who had lived quietly toward the end of his life, leaving behind very little explanation and even fewer clues, except for one thing. This card, the same card now sitting in an ATM machine, as systems across the bank continued to react. Because according to internal findings that would later be reviewed, this account didn't behave like any normal account. It bypassed checks. It accessed layers of infrastructure that had long since been replaced, and most importantly, it carried a status that no one in that building could fully explain. And as questions began to build, one thing became clear. This wasn't an accident, it was something that had been set up deliberately years ago by someone who understood exactly how the system worked and possibly how it would evolve. And as Emily finally pulled the card back out, still unsure whether it had worked or failed, the truth was already moving toward her, faster than she could imagine. Because somewhere in that building, a decision had been made, and that decision would bring her face to face with a past that had been waiting, silently, for this exact moment to return. By the time Emily Carter stepped away from the machine, pulling her coat tighter against the cold, she still didn't know whether anything had gone through, whether the card had worked or failed, but what she did know was that the silence from that machine felt unusual, heavier than a simple decline transaction. And as she walked away into the night, somewhere else, far removed from the quiet street she had just left behind, conversations had already begun. The kind that don't happen over routine banking activity, because according to internal reports that would later be referenced, the alert tied to her transaction had escalated beyond standard protocol almost instantly, reaching senior analysts who initially believed it to be a system error, something outdated triggering falsely. But as they looked closer, comparing the account structure to current systems, it became clear that this was not a glitch. This was something preserved, something that had existed long before modern safeguards were even put in place, and that realization shifted the tone entirely, because if this account had survived untouched for that long, then someone had made sure it would. And that raised a question none of them could immediately answer. Why? Emily, meanwhile, had only one concern: finding a place to stay for the night, her mind still replaying everything that had led her there. The arguments, the silence that followed, the moment she realized she no longer had access to the life she once thought was secure. And like many stories that reach this point, it wasn't a single event that caused everything to fall apart. It was a series of moments, small decisions, misunderstandings, and according to people close to the situation, growing distance that eventually became impossible to ignore. Her marriage to Daniel Carter had once appeared stable from the outside, the kind of life many people assume will simply continue without interruption. But behind closed doors, things had changed, and while exact details remain private, reports suggest that financial disagreements played a role, creating tension that only intensified over time until separation became inevitable. And when it did, Emily found herself in a position she never expected, starting over with very little to rely on, except for something she hadn't thought about in years. That memory, the one that led her to the card, went back to her grandfather, Robert Carter, a man who, according to public records and archived financial documents, had lived a life that didn't fully align with the quiet image he presented later on. Neighbors remembered him as reserved, someone who kept to himself, but there were also accounts suggesting that earlier in his life, he had been involved in complex financial dealings, the kind that required deep understanding of systems most people never see. And while no official record fully outlines the extent of his work, investigators who later reviewed the case noted patterns that hinted at connections to institutions and networks that operated differently from what Emily would have recognized growing up. And yet, despite whatever role he may have played, he left behind very little explanation. No detailed instructions, no clear indication of what he had set in motion. Only that one statement Emily could still remember clearly, that if she ever reached a point where she had no other choice, she should use the card. Back at the bank, that instruction was now echoing in a completely different context, because as analysts continued to examine the account, they began to uncover layers that didn't match any standard framework. According to internal findings, the account didn't just exist outside normal tracking systems. It interacted with them in a way that suggested it had been intentionally designed to remain functional regardless of technological changes, almost like it had been built with the future in mind. And that level of foresight raised serious questions about who Robert Carter really was and what he understood at the time he created it, because this wasn't something an average individual could set up. It required access, knowledge, and possibly authorization that extended far beyond what was publicly known. And as those questions circulated internally, the situation escalated again, this time reaching the CEO directly, a move that, according to staff accounts, was highly unusual, reserved only for matters with significant implications. When the CEO reviewed the details, what stood out wasn't just the account itself, it was its history, or more accurately, the lack of visible activity combined with its continued presence. Because in most cases, accounts that remain inactive for extended periods are either closed or absorbed into newer systems, but this one had been maintained, untouched yet fully operational, and that suggested intention. A decision made long ago that was now resurfacing under circumstances no one could have anticipated. And as he considered the implications, one option became clear. He needed to speak directly to the person who had triggered it, not through intermediaries, not through formal notices, but personally, because whatever this account represented, it wasn't something that could be handled through standard procedures. Emily didn't expect the call when it came, her phone ringing at a time when she was still trying to figure out her next step. And for a moment she hesitated, unsure whether to answer, because at that point, everything felt uncertain. Every unknown number carried the possibility of more bad news. But when she finally picked up, what she heard was not what she expected. A calm, measured voice introducing itself, asking a question that immediately shifted everything. "Where did you get that card?" And, according to later accounts, the tone of that conversation was not accusatory. It was focused, deliberate, as though the answer carried more weight than Emily could yet understand. And as she responded, explaining what little she knew, mentioning her grandfather's name, there was a pause, brief but noticeable, and in that pause something changed, because the name Robert Carter was not unfamiliar to the person on the other end of the line. And that recognition marked the beginning of a deeper investigation, one that would move beyond the account itself and into the past it was connected to. A past that, according to emerging details, held more significance than anyone initially realized. That pause on the line lingered just long enough for Emily Carter to notice it, even if she couldn't yet understand what it meant. And when the voice returned, it carried a different weight, more careful, more measured, as though every word now mattered in a way it hadn't before. And according to later accounts, the CEO did not immediately explain what he knew. Instead, he asked a series of quiet questions, confirming details: her full name, her grandfather's name, how long she had kept the card, whether anyone else had access to it. And while to Emily it felt like an ordinary verification process, internally it was something else entirely, because each answer aligned with fragments of records that had not been accessed in years. Records that, according to investigators who would later review them, were never fully integrated into modern systems, almost as if they had been intentionally left separate, preserved in a way that ensured they would only surface under very specific conditions. As the call ended, Emily was left with more questions than answers, told only that the bank would be in touch again and that she should not attempt to use the card elsewhere until they clarified the situation, a request that, under normal circumstances, might have sounded routine, but given everything that had already happened, carried a sense of urgency she couldn't ignore. And that night, as she tried to rest, the uncertainty stayed with her, because for the first time, it wasn't just her situation that felt unstable. It was the realization that something from her past, something she barely understood, had suddenly become the center of attention for people far removed from her everyday life. Inside the bank, however, the situation continued to unfold at a much faster pace, because once Robert Carter's name had been confirmed, access was granted to a restricted archive, one that, according to internal documentation, contained legacy accounts and historical agreements dating back several decades. And as analysts began to go through those files, patterns started to emerge, references to financial structures that no longer existed in the same form, agreements that operated under older regulatory frameworks, and most notably, a classification attached to certain accounts that indicated they were not to be altered, closed, or reviewed without executive authorization. a designation that immediately set Emily's situation apart from anything else currently active within the institution. According to reports, Robert Carter's account fell into that exact category, but what made it even more unusual was the absence of typical identifiers. There were no standard transaction histories available through the primary system, no easily traceable links to other accounts, and yet, despite that lack of visibility, the account remained fully operational, as though it existed alongside the modern system rather than within it. And that raised a possibility that investigators began to consider carefully, that this account may have been part of a broader structure, one designed not just for storage of funds, but for preservation over time, insulated from changes in policy, technology, and even ownership within the bank itself. As these findings were compiled, the CEO requested a more detailed review, not just of the account, but of Robert Carter himself, because understanding the origin of the account meant understanding the person who created it. And while public records painted a relatively simple picture, a man who lived quietly, with no widely known business empire or public profile, deeper archival materials suggested something more complex, according to financial documents and internal notes from decades earlier. Robert Carter had been involved in transactions that required a level of access not typically granted to individuals, interactions with senior figures within financial institutions, agreements that were structured differently from standard client relationships. And while none of these records alone provided a complete explanation, together they pointed to a role that extended beyond that of an ordinary account holder. Meanwhile, Emily received a second call the following day, this time requesting that she come in person to a specific branch, not her local branch, but one located in a financial district, a detail that, according to later reflections, stood out to her immediately because it suggested that whatever was happening, it wasn't being handled through standard channels. And when she arrived, the atmosphere confirmed that impression. She was greeted not by a teller, but by someone who introduced themselves as part of a specialized team. Someone who already knew her name before she spoke. And as she was escorted into a private office, the distance between her current reality and the life she had known just days earlier became even more apparent. The conversation that followed was careful, structured, and according to accounts from individuals familiar with the process, designed to gather information without revealing too much too quickly. Emily was asked about her grandfather again, about her relationship with him, about anything he may have told her regarding finances or assets. And while she answered honestly, there was very little she could add beyond what she had already said, because Robert Carter had never spoken in detail about his past, at least not in a way that made sense at the time, and that lack of clarity only deepened the mystery, because it suggested that whatever he had set up, he had done so without leaving behind a clear explanation for the person who would eventually inherit it. As the meeting continued, one detail finally surfaced that shifted everything for Emily. The account tied to the card was not empty. In fact, according to preliminary assessments, it contained a balance that had been accumulating over time, influenced by structures that were no longer commonly used, but had been maintained under the original agreement. And while the exact figure was not immediately disclosed, the implication was clear. This was not a small amount. It was something significant, something that, if confirmed and accessible, would change her situation entirely. And yet, even as that possibility became real, it came with uncertainty. Because access to the account was not automatic, it required verification, documentation, and most importantly, confirmation that Emily was the rightful beneficiary of something that had never been formally transferred in a conventional sense. Investigators, according to reports, approached this stage cautiously because the unusual nature of the account meant that standard inheritance procedures did not fully apply. And while there was no indication of wrongdoing on Emily's part, the complexity of the structure required careful review to ensure that everything aligned with current regulations. And as that process began, new questions continued to emerge, not only about the account itself, but about why Robert Carter had chosen to set it up this way, why he had kept it hidden, and why he had left behind so little guidance for the person who would eventually activate it. And as these questions moved through the system, one possibility became increasingly difficult to ignore: that this account was never meant to be discovered under normal circumstances. It was meant to remain dormant until someone reached a point where they truly had no other option. And in that sense, Emily's situation aligned almost exactly with what her grandfather had anticipated. A moment of need so complete that it would justify unlocking something that had been sealed away for decades. And as that realization began to take shape, the story shifted once again. From a simple financial anomaly to something far more personal, a connection between past and present that was only just beginning to reveal itself. As the review moved toward its final stage, Emily Carter found herself sitting in the same quiet office where everything had first been explained, only now the tone had shifted. Less uncertainty, more clarity, but still a sense that what she was about to hear carried weight beyond numbers on a screen. And according to those familiar with the case, the verification process had confirmed what the bank needed to proceed: her identity, her connection to Robert Carter, and the legitimacy of the account itself. But even with that confirmation, there were conditions attached, not obstacles in the traditional sense, but safeguards built into the original structure, requirements that reflected the intent behind the account rather than the policies of the present. And when those details were finally shared with her, it became clear that her grandfather had not simply left behind money, he had left behind a system, one designed to ensure that whoever accessed it would do so with purpose, not impulse. The balance, when it was finally revealed, was enough to change the direction of her life entirely, a figure that, according to internal estimates, had grown steadily over decades through mechanisms that were rarely used anymore, but had been preserved under the original agreement. And for a moment, the reality of it all felt distant, almost unreal. Because just days earlier, she had been standing outside in the rain with nowhere to go. And now she was being told that the solution she had hoped for, the one she barely believed would work, had opened something far greater than she could have imagined. But even in that moment, the focus was not entirely on what she had gained. It was on what came next, because access to the account required a decision. Not just acceptance, but understanding, an acknowledgement of the responsibility tied to it. According to reports, one of the final conditions involved a declaration of intent, a step that ensured the account would not simply be transferred and forgotten, but used in a way that aligned with the original framework established by Robert Carter. And while the exact wording of that condition remains private, those who reviewed it described it as something more reflective than restrictive, a reminder that the account had been created with a long-term perspective, not just for wealth, but for stability, for continuity, and perhaps for protection against moments exactly like the one Emily had experienced. And as she considered that, the story began to settle into something clearer, not just a sudden change in fortune, but a connection between generations, a decision made in the past reaching forward into the present at precisely the right time. In the days that followed, the process was completed, carefully, deliberately, with attention to every detail. And when it was done, Emily Carter was no longer in the position she had been in when this began. She had options, security, and a path forward that had not existed before. But more importantly, she had answers. Not all of them, but enough to understand that her grandfather's actions had not been random. They had been intentional, shaped by knowledge and foresight that extended beyond what he ever explained during his lifetime. And while many questions about his past remained, what mattered now was what he had left behind. Not just in financial terms, but in the form of a safeguard, something that had waited quietly until it was needed. Looking back, according to those who later reflected on the case, what made this story stand out was not just the scale of what was discovered, but the timing of it, the way everything aligned at a moment when it mattered most. And while it would be easy to see it purely as luck or coincidence, the structure of the account suggested otherwise. It suggested planning, an understanding that circumstances change, that people face moments of uncertainty, and that sometimes the difference between losing everything and starting again comes down to something small, something easily overlooked, like an old card stored away and forgotten until the moment it becomes necessary. Emily herself chose to move forward quietly, without drawing attention to what had happened, focusing instead on rebuilding her life in a way that reflected the stability she had been given. And while details of her future remain private, those familiar with her situation describe a sense of calm that replaced the uncertainty she once carried. A shift that, in many ways, mirrored the purpose behind the account itself, not excess, not spectacle, but security, and in that sense, the story reaches a kind of resolution. Not with a dramatic ending, but with a steady one, grounded in the idea that sometimes the most important changes are the ones that allow life to continue without fear. And yet, even with everything resolved, one question remains, one that continues to draw attention from those who hear about this case. What did Robert Carter truly know when he created that account? What did he see coming that led him to design something that could outlast decades of change? And while investigators and analysts have offered their perspectives, the full answer may never be known, because some decisions are made with a level of foresight that only becomes visible in hindsight. And perhaps that is what makes this story resonate. Not just the outcome, but the idea that something set in motion long ago can return at exactly the moment it is needed, changing the course of a life in a way that feels both unexpected and, at the same time, strangely inevitable. So now the question turns to you. If you found yourself in the same position, with a past you didn't fully understand suddenly offering you a second chance, would you trust it? Would you follow it through? Or would you walk away from something you couldn't completely explain? Let us know what you think. And if this story stayed with you, there's another one you won't want to miss, because sometimes the truth behind these moments goes even deeper than it first appears.